Let's give a round of applause for Parker Lewis, Unchained Capital.
Thank you, Slim. All right, that was a great introduction. Really appreciate it. I was just going to tell a little bit about before I bring my slides up how I got here, and not so much to Bitcoin, but I heard Slim talk on one of my friend Marty Bent, who was here earlier this morning, on his podcast, and he was talking about decentralizing the food supply and food intelligence and the importance of that. And then maybe about a month or two later, he recorded again with Marty, and then they came into our office to record Slim and Cole. And I got a chance to sit down with Slim and Cole, and then went to an event at Cooper's in Austin. And hearing both of them talk about what it is that they do and why it's important, and there's a lot of consistency with the Bitcoin community, or at least the ethos of that. And then I bought some steak from Cole over the Lightning Network, and that when you start to understand Bitcoin, you start to understand that it's built on this principle of decentralization. That the only reason why Bitcoin works is decentralization. And a lot of the themes, Mary Kerr talked about this with centralization and ultimately the co-option or corruption of the healthcare system. But when you centralize systems, you start to get really bad outcomes. And all of it, in my opinion, starts at the money supply, and that the money supply became centralized, and then everything around it started to centralize: wealth, healthcare systems, food supply, food processing. And so today what I'm going to talk about is the fundamentals of Bitcoin, because if I talk about decentralization, the reason why Bitcoin is valuable is centered on this idea in a lot of these talks. It's that no one will ever store their wealth in Bitcoin without first understanding it. And so I know there are Bitcoiners in the audience, but this is for Charles. This morning he said he didn't know anything about Bitcoin, or anybody here that doesn't know Bitcoin. What I'm gonna build from the first principles of why Bitcoin is valuable, but I'm gonna also relate it in a way that should connect home. And I think, the way I frame it is there's three phases to people's understanding of Bitcoin. There's certain people that can't see it at all. And I think about that as a blank screen. And then there's a lot of us Bitcoiners who see it as the Sistine Chapel, where there's a saying in Bitcoin that Bitcoin fixes this, or fix the money, fix the world. But that once you start to understand Bitcoin, you start to see and understand not just that so much is broken, but why so much of it originates from the money. And then there's a stage in between, which I describe as a silhouette emerging from the fog. And that is the point that I would describe as like, okay, I couldn't see anything, and then maybe. With this presentation, I try to get people to that point of maybe this isn't crazy, or maybe this is starting to make sense. And then once you get to that maybe point, once you get to the point of some idea clicking, then the process to getting to seeing it as the Sistine Chapel or the masterpiece is inevitable. So trying to get the newcomers to that silhouette emerging from the shadow. So could we go to the first slide? Okay, so my best way to describe Bitcoin, or to help people understand Bitcoin, is describe my own journey. So I was working at a hedge fund in Dallas at the time, and I think a lot of people look at Bitcoin and they see a lot of tech bros, and they hear people talking about blockchain, and blockchain is going to change the world, and they think that it's a combination of snake oil and digital beanie babies. But really, for me, I came to this really serendipitously. I was researching what would happen, and this was in 2016, what would happen when the Federal Reserve, the person who's responsible for managing our money supply, what would happen when they start to unwind or take out the emergency measures from post-financial crisis? And during the financial crisis, or in the years after, the Federal Reserve created $3.6 trillion new dollars. And in order to understand what would happen when they started to reverse that, I had to understand what would happen or why they did it in the first place. And so what I have on this slide is all of those emergency measures that they took. This is Jimmy talked about M2 earlier, which is broad money. This is base money. This is the actual dollars that the Fed creates on a primary basis. And while the numbers are difficult to see, pre-financial crisis we were at about $1 trillion. Today we're at about $9 trillion. But when I went down that path of trying to understand, well, what would happen when the Fed took out the dollars that they put back, that they put into the system, and this was, I'm going to go over to the screen and point to it, but this was around this period when they weren't doing anything with the money supply, that at that point in time, I came to the conclusion that they were going to have to print trillions more and that they were always going to have to do that, and I'll help you guys understand that today. But the root problem that Bitcoin solves is the fact that governments and central banks are printing trillions of dollars, very similar to what Jimmy said. But everyone literally in the world suffers from the problem of not having a good form of money, but money is really difficult to understand. I like to say, and I'll have a slide on this, which is the hardest thing to understand about Bitcoin is money. It's not actually Bitcoin. And that if you want to understand Bitcoin, you have to first ask yourself the question, what is money? But I came to the conclusion that they were going to have to print trillions more and that it was inevitable. And
Can you tell us why did they print all that money? Why did they have to print it? You just said they had to print more money.
Yeah, so the question was, why did they have to print the money? Well, back before the financial crisis, when there was $1 trillion, there was $52.5 trillion of dollar-denominated debt. And so that meant that every actual dollar that existed had been lent out 50 times over. And that credit system, the $52.5 trillion, started to collapse. And it only got to that point because over time the Fed had steadily put smaller and smaller amounts of money in the system. But it was the degree of leverage, the amount of debt to the actual number of dollars, and then once the system started to collapse, they had to inject more money. And that when they injected the money post-financial crisis, all it can do, and all it's designed to do, is to cause that credit problem to expand. If you have a debt problem, you can either restructure your debt, reduce it, or in the Fed's world, you put more money in to be able to sustain it. But it doesn't just sustain it, it causes it to grow. But I make this point, I call this slide, fool me once, shame on you, fool me 4 times, shame on me. And it's that after the financial crisis, they did 3 rounds of QE, totaling $3.6 trillion. And the rhetorical question is, if QE works, if money printing works, why do they always need to do more? Because I came to the conclusion, well, it was flat, but then when COVID happened, most people associated with COVID. It had nothing to do with COVID. It was that this solution to the problem only makes the problem worse, and it always requires that they need more because it can only work in their context by creating more debt, and that was actually the problem in the first place. So can we go to the next slide? So at the same time when I was going down this path of understanding the Fed and money printing and that was a problem, I think it should be intuitive. Most people don't understand it, but people are printing your money. That is a problem, and it's a problem that everyone in the world shares. I also was sent up to do some diligence on a company. It ultimately led me to meet a guy named Safety Namus, who ultimately wrote a book called The Bitcoin Standard, and he really helped me understand money. But during that time, I started to understand why Bitcoin was valuable. And this is like, if there's one thing that I want those of you who are new to take away from this presentation, it is this one point. That is, all value in Bitcoin derives from the fact that there will only ever be 21 million. That Bitcoin's true innovation is finite scarcity, but what that ultimately means is that it provides a foundation of money that can't be printed. And that is a value and benefit to literally everybody in the world, and Bitcoin is permissionless. I go so far as to say that if Bitcoin credibly enforces a fixed supply of 21 million, that it will become the global reserve currency. It will replace the dollar. It will replace every form of money that exists, and I'll talk a little bit about why that is. Now, that's a really big statement, but I also qualify it by saying if Bitcoin cannot credibly enforce a fixed supply of 21 million, then that won't happen. And again, that is the point that I want you guys to take away. It is that all value derives from 21 million. That is the value proposition because it represents a form of money that can't be printed, and that trying to understand why that is relevant, you won't get there without first asking the question of what is money, but I'll talk about some of those principles today. This slide, the blue line, is the 21 million asymptotic supply curve. The stair-stepping down of the orange is the rate of issuance, and that every 4 years approximately, the rate of issuance gets cut in half, and if you cut in half, cut in half, cut in half all the way, ultimately you get to zero. And the key here is Bitcoin is finite, it is trustless, it is permissionless, it is global, and that there's this key thing called proof of work. That this doesn't just happen by magic. It doesn't just happen because there's magic software code. It's not voodoo. And while understanding truly the how it happens, how is it possible for there only to be 21 million? What does that even mean? Don't focus on that question. First, ask yourselves the question. I'm just giving you guys the framework. It's ask the question why it's relevant, because that is then necessary to understanding the how. Let's go to the next slide, though. I don't want to just, there's a saying in Bitcoin, which I'll resurface at the end, which is verify, don't trust. It's not to say take my word for it, but I don't want to just say ignore how it happens, but I do want to connect one idea. That there's a lot of things that go into how that happens. There's a lot underneath the hood as to how Bitcoin credibly enforces a fixed supply of 21 million, but that the answer is connected to energy. It's rooted in real-world resources, and this graphic that I have on this page is an oil well producing, or a natural gas well producing power, and then that power is securing the Bitcoin network. There's this concept called proof of work mining. All you should think about is there's energy and real-world energy resources securing the Bitcoin network 24 hours a day. Today, it's between 18 and 20 gigawatts of power, and it will grow far larger as more people value Bitcoin. It will attract more security. But that when I say that it isn't voodoo, it is real-world energy resources right here in Texas, all over the world, are securing the Bitcoin network, and there's a reason why no other cryptocurrency is relevant. Can I go to the next slide? So before I go beyond that to some deeper principles, everyone, it's important to recognize that everyone that's looked at Bitcoin and had it not make sense, it didn't make sense for me for a long time. I was not somebody, I'm a very actually risk-averse person, and I've got over 90% of my savings, probably 95% of my savings in Bitcoin. I don't view it as a risk, but I didn't just jump into this, and I don't recommend people do that either. That you require knowledge to be able to do that and a deep understanding of Bitcoin. But making the point that I didn't just go straight in, I looked at Bitcoin, struggled with it for a long time, but that the important thing is to recognize that everybody does. That Bitcoin is difficult to see, and there's a lot of questions. These are some of them. People look at it and they'll say, yeah, it's too slow, it can't support all the transactions. It's too volatile to be money. We see it go up and down. How can that thing be money when it behaves like a stock, or I think about it like a stock? Can it just be copied? There's 1,000 cryptocurrencies. Like, why is it this one? Couldn't the government just ban it? Isn't it just for criminals or illicit activities? There's people who say that quantum computing will come on and shut it down. It's ridiculous. They don't understand it. But, this is a good one. People say it's bad for the environment, where that I told you that Bitcoin consumes 18 to 20 gigawatts of power. People look at it and they say, that is a waste of energy. And I always come back and I say, if you don't understand the value of Bitcoin, you will never understand the justification for its cost. And that if most people recognize that most people don't understand Bitcoin, that anybody who is commenting on the energy usage of Bitcoin without understanding it or its value is wholly unqualified, and that anybody that starts to see why Bitcoin is valuable at a fundamental level, a non-speculative level, they will never question the amount of energy that Bitcoin consumes. But the point here is there's a lot of questions, and there are answers to all of them. And that if you could imagine any question, you find a Bitcoiner, and they will be able to explain the answer to you because they had to struggle with that question themselves. And that is not to say trust, it is to say you should verify, but anchor to that point. So, I mentioned this before. Bitcoin is hard to understand because money is hard to understand. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the principles of money. And it is that at a root level, money helps solve the problem of trade, and it allows for specialization. I'll talk a little bit about what that means. But there's this really important point that money is unique from all other goods and services in the market. Most people don't understand money. They've never questioned what it is. But you cannot go into a grocery store and buy food for real estate. You can't do that for a U.S. Treasury. You can't do that for a stock or a bond. That money serves a very unique purpose, and not everything can be money. But this is a really important idea. Without money, we would not have very basic necessities. We would not have food, water. None of us would have gotten here today without the coordination function of money. We needed cars. We needed gasoline. We show up, we don't even think about it. We go to the gas station, we fill up, and we go. That only actually happens because there's this economic good called money that very few people understand. But when you ask people, and I encourage people to do this in their day-to-day lives, which is ask people what money is or why it has value. Most people will say that it's a collective hallucination, or they'll say that it's a belief system. But if you go to a grocery store and you start thinking about all the goods and services that got there, it's not some magic coincidence that hundreds of millions of people worked all day to get whatever you wanted at your disposal whenever you need it. But that there are objective properties that define what is and what isn't money, or what an economic good must have in terms of properties in order to be valuable as money. The foundation is scarcity, though. It's not just scarcity, but that should be an intuitive idea that something will not retain value if somebody can easily print it, and that is what happens to the US dollar. Now, what the schematic that I have on here is this important part where I say that money facilitates trade. It's what actually enables trade at any form of scale, and that it's human beings produce value, cattle. They don't produce cattle, but they preserve cattle over long periods of time, conserve them, produce them, process them, ultimately get them to market. But they don't trade cattle for oil. They trade cattle for money and then take that money and go buy oil or whatever that they need in their life. This property of money that allows that to happen, it is essentially allowing you to exchange, think about it, 8 hours a day, exchanging it into money, and then that money preserving value over time so that you can exchange it at a later point. Things that are not scarce do not hold value, and you feel that. The way you find that out in your everyday life is you go to the grocery store and beef is 40% more expensive or 50% more expensive. All of that is happening because your money is getting destroyed and printed. If you go to the next slide. All right, so when I talk about money coordinating all economic activity, and I talk about how none of us would be here without the coordination function of money. Just think about an oil rig. There are more than 30 components, but there are 30 key components, and then think about the complexity. Even if you don't know oil rigs, just imagine how complex each small little part is. How do you get all of those goods refined into one place when each one of those goods has their own complex supply chain? You actually need money to be able to produce goods to then develop higher level and more complex goods. Without money, you would not have anything. You literally would not have food, clean water, basic health care, gas at the gasoline station. I'm not even talking about the internet or iPhones. You wouldn't have the things that you take for granted in your life. Next slide. All right. So this is where I get back to Bitcoin and why Bitcoin fits in terms of being able to facilitate this function of trade so much better. That people look at Bitcoin, it doesn't make any sense. Charles, doesn't make any sense, and we recognize that. But again, that's because money doesn't make sense. We don't understand that. But it's not a collective hallucination. It's not a belief system. It is a tangible object. It is a tangible good. And that when I tell people that Bitcoin is only valuable because there will only ever be 21 million, and that I make the statement, if Bitcoin credibly enforces a fixed supply of 21 million, that it will become the global reserve currency, it is based on the two principles on this slide. There is an optimal monetary policy, and all I mean by monetary policy is the supply or schedule of issuance, and that the best money supply is one that is fixed. There is nothing magical about 21 million. The thing that is relevant is that in a terminal state, nobody can produce more. And what that translates to in functional terms is that nobody else can print your money. And that should be an intuitive idea. Again, set Bitcoin aside, and it's a very simple common sense equation. There are two forms of money. There is one that nobody can print, option A. Option B, your government prints a shit ton of money, and that what that means is that if you go to work for 8 hours a day, if you contribute value to other human beings, that value is guaranteed to purchase less in the future. And that has really bad outcomes, economically, culturally, fabric of a society level. But when I bring it back to the common sense, it's good A, good B. One thing can't be printed, one other thing is getting printed massively. Which one will you choose? The common sense person, if they start to understand this 999 out of 1,000 without understanding anything, will say, pay me in the form of money that can't be printed. So that the idea is that there is a best, and that the best form of money is one that has the lowest rate of change, and the lowest rate of change is one that in a terminal state, no more can be produced. So that's key idea number one. That should be more intuitive. The second idea is less intuitive. It is that money and monetary networks, think trading networks, people who use the common form of money, that they converge to one. The competition between money is not like competition between companies. And that is something that's hard for people to grapple with, because they look around the world, they see dollars, euros, yen, bolivar, pesos, and they see 1,000 cryptocurrencies. But if you think about one-to-one, me trading with you, I have to have the form of money that you accept. We have to have arrived on the consensus of what money we all use. But if I think about that micro example of me with any one of you individuals, then multiply you out to the next person, you out to the next person. It is the same exact problem for all 8 billion people in the world, and if money is solving a problem of trade, which is inherently intersubjective, that arriving at consensus or agreeing on what the form of money is a prerequisite for that money to be able to facilitate trade. And that if you come back to this idea that there is a best form of money, everyone is always incentivized to find and seek out that good that's going to do the one job of, I trade my value today and I need to reclaim that value at some point in the future to trade with someone else. It's the identical problem. And it's all solved by one. But I use an example to help this make sense, which is that idea of money converging to one might not make sense in terms of a fundamental principle. But if you think about all the times that you transact in a day, you're only using one form of money typically. Now, Bitcoiners, we're starting to use two, but we're in this transitionary state. But 99.9% of the people just functionally only trade in one form of money in a single day. And it's like, well, is that by coincidence? Like dollars, we trade dollars. Euros, we trade euros. Yen. There might be a few multinational corporations that on any given day are trading in dollars, euros, and yen. There might be some people who live on a border that trade in pesos in the morning and go across and trade in dollars. But You're only transacting in dollars here, and then the question is why, and is that by coincidence? It's not by coincidence. It's because money solves the problem of trade. We all share the same problem, and we all have to agree in order to be able to trade. There are 4 key questions, though, that I tell people to ask themselves, and this is a framework to think about Bitcoin. This is the roadmap. Is Bitcoin actually finitely scarce? If so, how? If it is, does that make Bitcoin viable as money? And I tell people, rather than ask the question of how it's possible, first ask the question of why, because the question of why it's relevant is also critical to understanding how it's actually happening. You have to understand why Bitcoin is valuable in order to understand why people would secure it. But then there's a critical question that most people stumble with, which is, why can't Bitcoin be copied? There's 1,000 cryptocurrencies. They are all irrelevant to me. I've only ever stored my wealth in Bitcoin. It's because I recognized that there is a best form of money. It is the one with the lowest rate of change, and that everyone has to agree on that consensus, and that the evaluation of what makes a good form of money is not subjective, that it is objective. It's always relative to one or another good. And then, do monetary systems converge to one? Because that question is related to why Bitcoin can't be copied. If monetary systems converge to one, it doesn't matter how many times you copy Bitcoin, you will never be able to credibly recreate or credibly enforce to the degree that Bitcoin can its monetary supply, and you're attempting to solve the same problem. If you can go to the next slide. So this is kind of bringing it back up to the high level. I personally had to understand why gold was money in order to understand why Bitcoin was money. And that might not be intuitive to people, because most people don't understand gold, and I don't say that you have to, but the same reasons that what you have to accept about gold is, you probably have heard of the gold standard. And even if you don't understand gold, over 2,000 years, the entire world converged on one form of money. That was because it was relatively scarce, but gold had a problem. Gold was scarce, but it was difficult to divide and transfer, and that's opposed to the dollar, which is easy to transfer, but it's not scarce. Dollars are infinite. Bitcoin is both finitely scarce and easy to transfer. The combination of those two things is what makes it so valuable as money. And so I think about that as Bitcoin combines the strengths of physical gold and the strengths of the digital dollar without the weaknesses of either of those two things. Next slide. People think that Bitcoin's complicated. It is difficult to see. I wouldn't say that it's complicated. Bitcoin is more common sense. You've got a problem. Your government is printing money. Your time is finitely scarce. Like I try to focus people on, they spend 8 hours a day. Charles, you spend 8 hours a day, and you're getting cattle to market to feed people. You cannot continue to trade your scarce time for something that is easily printed. You need a form of money that matches the scarcity of your time and the value that you create and provide to others with a form of money that is equally as scarce, and that it is all about supply. It is all about those 2 slides that I showed you at the beginning. It is about the Fed printing money, and that is going to continue from this day to all the end of our lives and future generations. Trillions are being created out of thin air. Jimmy described some of how credit is created, but when the Federal Reserve over the last 2 years has created $4.7 trillion new dollars, they literally do it just by clicking a button on a computer screen. You do all the work. Cole was talking about all the work running 20 head of cattle and making $13,000, and then they just zap it, print it. And that if trillions are being created out of thin air, Bitcoin has a fixed supply, and it is secured by energy. And while you might look at Bitcoin trading on a screen and think of it like a stock, and it might look volatile, that if you can see that yellow line, that is Bitcoin zooming out and looking at a log scale of its chart. And that as people stare at this equation and try to understand why people are over here looking at this thing Bitcoin, they find the signal. It's not to say that there aren't people that speculate and that don't understand Bitcoin and buy it without understanding it. It's that the people that look for the signal find it here. You have a problem, Your central bank's printing trillions of dollars. That is unsustainable, not just in concept. It's because your time is scarce. You're producing value, and you cannot do that and be in a position where you are guaranteed for that value that you've delivered to purchase less in the future, because at some point Venezuela happens. When you print a lot of money, it actually destroys economic systems. But that the value of Bitcoin is really, people are looking and saying, what am I more willing to store my value in that's going to better store the value that I've already delivered to other human beings? It's the form of money that can't be printed when I'm sitting there with money that can be printed. So my talk is going to round out on custody of how you secure Bitcoin. But I really anchor to this point, which is that Bitcoin scarcity and all those ideas that I talked about, it's not a value to you if you don't understand Bitcoin. No one is going to be willing to store their wealth in Bitcoin or accept payment for their goods and services without understanding why Bitcoin will store value over time. And that is why education is so critical. We focus a lot, this is what we do as a company, we focus a lot on education because it's what makes good clients, it's what builds foundational relationships and generational relationships. The foundation of our business is really custody, so we focus on education in two ways. We focus on why Bitcoin has fundamental value and how to secure it. What differentiates us in the market, appreciate Michael mentioning us before, but we're not like a bank. We don't take people's Bitcoin and hold on to it for them. We enable them to be able to hold their Bitcoin in a way that gives them permissionless access to their wealth, such that if anything happened to us or we prevented access to an account, that there is no man or woman, no bureaucrat that could stand between any of our clients and their money, because that money represents the value that they've delivered to the rest of the world over the nature of their life. I don't know how many of you guys saw what happened in Canada, where people donated to a trucker convoy and then boom, got zapped from their entire life savings. The way that we facilitate custody of Bitcoin, the way that really Bitcoin is formed and really native to Bitcoin, designed to be, is to enable people, to empower people to hold their own wealth. And until you do that, you can't really know what it means, because all of us have dollars and bank accounts. But when you put yourself in a position to store wealth in a form of money that can't be printed, that is not only cathartic, but then to do that in a way where it's permissionless, there is a massive amount of power in that. Now, with great power comes great responsibility, and that we have to educate, we have to teach people how to do that to ensure that it is secure, because this is critical. Bitcoin's scarcity is not a value to you if you don't understand it, but it's also not a value to you if it's possible to lose. And knowing how to secure Bitcoin, I've got a Bitcoin key here. If we can go to the next slide. The important thing to understand is that all Bitcoin are secured by cryptographic keys. What does that mean? This is a device that stores a Bitcoin key. We help people figure out how to use these devices. We like to say that Bitcoin's not harder than driving a car. It really isn't. You just have to be deliberate, because if you don't know how to drive a car and you get behind a wheel, it's going to be really dangerous for you. So we help people do that. But that keys are physical objects. Physical things are much easier to secure than digital information. And there's a saying in Bitcoin, which is not your keys, not your Bitcoin. What that means is if you're Bitcoin or in something like a Coinbase, those are not your keys. Those are Coinbase's keys. They are in control. You got to go knock on the door of Coinbase in order to get your funds. And that is how the legacy banking system works. That's actually how the system became centralized. That's how we got here. And Bitcoin decentralizes wealth. It only preserves that with finality if you are holding your own keys. And those ideas might not be entirely hitting home, but I think the core ones might. But you can also schedule a consultation with us. Our website's unchained.com. If you just go to that unchained.com, the first thing you'll see right in the center is schedule a consultation. Someone from our team will hop on and walk you through that in detail, and I'll be around here for the next 7 or 8 hours, hanging around all day. So if you want to come ask me about it, I'm here to answer questions. These are my last words of advice. Beware of snake oil salesmen. Again, this is my personal view, but it's also well-founded, well-reasoned. that there's a lot of snake oil salesmen out there, and that everybody pushing, 1,000 cryptocurrencies, you might think about it as get rich quick, or I'm going to take a chance on it. That's not what this is about. This is about preserving the value that you've already delivered to the world, and that you cannot risk that on a flyer. This is a really important point. Oftentimes when I say Bitcoin, people hear crypto. Nope. Crypto is not Bitcoin. Blockchain is not Bitcoin. Do not buy the hype. Do not buy things you do not understand. Now, that does not mean you have to understand Bitcoin as well as I do before you buy Bitcoin, but you have to start to understand why you should store wealth in the Bitcoin network, why it will store value over time, because if you don't, Bitcoin is volatile, and it will wreck you. And you can buy too much Bitcoin, that as your knowledge of Bitcoin grows, you will be able to tolerate its volatility a lot better, because every time something happens and Bitcoin goes up by 50% and down by 10%, sorry, I look at it and I say, did anything that happened in the world change the fact that Bitcoin can enforce a fixed supply of 21 million? If nothing changed about that, I buy more Bitcoin. But developing a framework for that is really critical to being able to tolerate that. But that this is the ultimate point. Time is scarce. Our time on this world, Earth, is finitely scarce. Time is also money. Bitcoin is scarce, Bitcoin is money, but always verify, don't trust, do your own research. Again, the thing that is hardest to understand about Bitcoin is money and what is money, but knowledge distributes over time and it's accelerating, and there are consequences to not doing the research. This isn't like some new tech where it's like, oh, if I didn't buy Apple stock, I would lose money. This is your wealth is being destroyed because they're printing your money out from underneath you, and you don't have to come to the same conclusions that I did, but it merits going down that path and developing a conclusion of your own, because it is ultimately your time and your family's time and your value. So that's it. I can answer a few questions if we got time. Yep.
The 21 million cap, central to your thesis is that if that stays intact, then buy more Bitcoin, by all means. I know that. You know that. Lots of people here know that. We're all going to die. How do our kids know that? How do we extend the consensus rules into the future?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot that's going to play out. And also, I want to describe quickly for those who, there was one thing that I meant to mention, and I'll answer this because it's related. My vision of how this plays out is that in the next 10 years, we entirely shift over to a Bitcoin standard. That's hard for people to see, but I do believe that that is happening a lot quicker, and it's not isolated to Bitcoin. It is because the underlying economic structure is becoming more and more unstable, and they're having to print more and more money to keep it intact. But that in the future, Bitcoin will be the unit of account. It won't be volatile. Like Michael walked through a bunch of the applications. You're just going to go to the grocery store and you're going to pay for things directly in Bitcoin. Bitcoin is going to price cattle. It's going to price oil. It's going to price natural gas. When that is true, to your question of how, and his question was, how are our children going to know that? Like, how is this going to be carried forward? People who come to see Bitcoin and why it is so valuable as money find this signal in the fact that it only works because of decentralization, and this energy that's securing Bitcoin and a lot of other complicated puzzle pieces, but that the value is derived from the fact that there will only ever be 21 million. How will that be carried forward into generations from now? I think that there are going to be a lot of lessons learned that when we all grew up, people did not learn about what is money. Again, I made that point. We all take money for granted because it always has just worked. Most people have never in school had a class that was like, what gives the dollar value? If they did, people would say it's a hallucination, it's a belief system, or because the government taxes people, which is not the case. That it's an objective evaluation of goods in the market. So I think that it's going to fundamentally alter, that this is going to be such a radical change, and that we're going to, I like to say, history is written by the winners. And Bitcoin is going to win. And that's not something I do want that, but that is something that is objectively going to happen because there are true things in the world. Money is a basic necessity. You can't store your value in a form of money that can be printed, and there is a better alternative, and it's voluntary and you can opt in, but those who opt in later are going to get dragged along because everybody needs money, and it funnels to one. And that the consequence of that is I have no worry that the next generation and the next, for the next 100 years, they're going to be reading about what happened. And the winners are going to write that history. Now, could humans screw it up in 500 years or 1,000 and forget those lessons? Yeah, but I think that that's probably true. One of the things that Safe Dean wrote about the Bitcoin standard was how Rome fell and the debasement of currency. We forgot those lessons. So it is possible, but I don't think that it's possible in anything that we would consider a long time horizon. It would be, like the event horizon. Charles.
How do we decouple the dollar from Bitcoin in terms of how we value it? Or is that, that's how it's valued now?
I wouldn't say that's how it's valued now. The dollar is our unit of account. So when we're driving on the road or doing anything in our lives, we're constantly doing like hundreds of economic calculations, and the dollar's our unit of account. So the dollar is also the most liquid good in the market today. Its liquidity is typically in the form of your cattle and my financial services in Bitcoin and oil and gas. But that Bitcoin is emerging is displacing the dollar as the most liquid good. It is most logical that the two most liquid goods would trade for each other first, and that as knowledge distributes and as more people figure out Bitcoin, more people will say, "Pay me in Bitcoin." Again, big part of the reason why I'm here. I went to that event, Cooper's, that Slim and Cole hosted, and afterwards I paid Cole for steaks in Bitcoin. And then we had an event in Austin, and I bought like 40 pounds of beef for an event in Bitcoin. That he's in a position to do that because he starts to develop a framework for why that thing will hold value. He has no context to do that. If you just think about a time series from now, T plus 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 4 year, knowledge is distributing, and it will only happen faster, and at that same time the government's going to print it. I will continue to spend my dollars so long as the gas station allows me to pay dollars, because I know my dollars are getting printed and that they're losing value. But that as a function of time, as knowledge distributes, as more people adopt it and say, pay me in Bitcoin, that prior chart of looking at, like thinking about as a stock, it will flip. The dollar will start to be volatile in the context of Bitcoin. And Bitcoin will become not only the most liquid good in the market, it will become the unit of account. We won't think about the value of a Bitcoin. We'll think the ribeye costs 5 sats, which is 100 millionths of a Bitcoin. That it will just be priced in that. Just like we don't think if a beer now costs $7, that's kind of funny, that the value of a dollar is 1/7 of a beer. So it will decouple as knowledge distributes, more people figure this out, light bulbs go off, and no longer play a game that is actively working in opposition to them, and when they decide to get off the hamster wheel. Matt.
A lot of people in this room care really about the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, the origin of Texas too. Can you talk about at a high level how Bitcoin is similar to the values that the founding fathers had and the state of Texas?
Yeah, I think maybe one idea that I would throw out there is that I think our country was founded on the basis of the individual, and that the rights of the individual, and that those rights don't come from government, and that if we build a structure of government around that idea, that is not only what's best for the individual on average, but it's also what creates the best outcomes in aggregate. That if you start managing on the aggregates, you have really bad outcomes for the individual. And I think that idea is inherent to Bitcoin, that Bitcoin empowers everybody. Bitcoin is permissionless. Anybody can store value in the network, anyone determined enough today, but in the future it's going to be so easy, it's like picking up a telephone. And that empowers the individual, but that there are societal consequences that are very beneficial when the individual has every incentive to be able to deliver value to others and have that preserved into the future, and that you eliminate moral hazard from the function of money. I think about here in Texas, I like to tell the story of Texas. Slim and I are going to do a podcast where we're going to talk about some of these ideas, But that when you think about the people that are here, and I know there's people from all over the place, and it's not to say any of you are inconsistent with that. You made your way to Kerrville. I like the fact that Slim was talking about that he did it here because people had to be intentional to get here, and then that creates a very high signal crowd. But that the people who founded Texas were largely people from Kentucky and Tennessee. There were also people from Alabama. But those people in Kentucky and Tennessee particularly, they left the colonies. Basically, once that area had become settled, they said, I want freedom. I'm going out. I don't care if it's dangerous. I want freedom. I'm going across the Appalachians, and I'll deal with whatever it is that's out there. Once they made that place safe, everybody else came from the original Northeast colonies. Well, those same people said, yeah, I want to be free, and they came down to Texas. And Texas really was the last frontier. And there's a lot of people moving from California. Everybody knows the weather's not so great here. Cole was joking about 105-degree weather for 60 days between July and August. People came here originally for freedom. Freedom is the filter of what brings people here. Bitcoin is about freedom. It is why the Bitcoin movement and the hub is here in Texas, I think, because there are these people that have this mindset that say, yeah, I'm going to go take on the citadel that is the Federal Reserve because I want to be free, and I'm not afraid. It's not to say people don't have any fears in their life, but that they're willing to contribute to that, to being a small part of a larger solution. So I do think that there are a lot of. I really think that Bitcoin as an idea, as an invention, as a foundational principle, there really isn't anything comparable to it that could be more consistent with the founding principles of America.
For everybody who's older in the crowd than these young people, I went down this rabbit hole, and it was almost precisely as you described. The same authors and everything at 59, 60. And I developed a relationship with Unchained. I'm 95% Bitcoin because it keeps growing, right? And my point is, it is cathartic to do to have that arrangement. These people are honest, and if you're older and just want to hear a different version, I'm happy to share it.
Well, thank you, Forrest, and I just met Forrest today, so that we really do value our clients. We care deeply about Bitcoin. Again, that's really why I'm here. I think that as an idea, having permissionless access to your wealth is incredibly powerful and important, and helping people not only understand Bitcoin but empowering people like Forrest and working with them. It's something that is really it's enjoyable to do, and there's a lot of things that a lot of people do jobs, and we work on Bitcoin, and I go around the state. One of the ideas I was going to talk about at the start, but I forgot, is that I think about money and food and energy as the foundational economic goods. If we don't have money, we can't get energy out of the ground. If we can't sustain ourselves with food and we can't trade to make that happen, that's a massive problem. So I spent a lot of my time in Houston educating the energy community. When I met Slim, or really before that, when I was hearing him talk and talking about the ideas that when he asked me to contribute on the education side, I was glad to. And not just glad to, I was happy to, I wanted to, and really wanted to lean into it. So I think that the work that Slim's doing is incredibly important. But yeah, everything that we do is about education. Bitcoiners are incredibly generous with their time, Michael particularly, but everybody who's here. And any questions that you have about Bitcoin, there's a lot of people who are doing the work to build this network. People see stock trading on a screen, and they're human beings, are your peers that are building a monetary network that is going to be a lifeboat for you. So just ask people questions. There are no dumb questions. So Slim, we're done?
Thank you, Parker. Everybody, Parker Lewis, thank you.